I've seen violence impact civilians in this country. Like, there are kidnappings every night. When it's dark and you go to sleep, there is no guarantee like you're gonna wake up tomorrow, because you might be kidnapped during the night. And also, like, you can't trust anyone in this country. Your friends might be a rebel. So, like, this country is totally a mess.
That was Novice Ngondo talking to the stream earlier about life in Central African Republic. Fighting over election results have resulted in tens of thousands of civilians fleeing Central African Republic. Hi, I'm Femi OK. You're watching the stream. On today's episode, we will be unpacking what is happening down on the ground in the Central African Republic. I know you have questions and comments. If you're watching on YouTube, you can jump into the comment section and be part of today's discussion. Al Jazeera has been covering the conflicts in the Central African Republic for many years, and this month, in fact just last week, our correspondent Malcolm Webb was down on the ground seeing what was happening to refugees who are fleeing the Central African Republic and going to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Here's Malcolm Webb reporting.
Our arrival drew a crowd. People here say they've been waiting for help since they arrived here last week. They lined up, hoping we'd brought it. And more keep coming. Others go back to retrieve possessions from their homes or crops from their farms. That's what Elizabeth Poma tried, but she came back with nothing.
The
rebels attacked our village last week. We heard a lot of gunfire. They destroyed everything. They raped girls and they kidnapped some of them. We didn't see exactly what happened because we had to run.
Malcolm Webb joins us for our show today, and he's joined by Romain and also by David. Romain, tell our audience who you are and what you do.
Romain Declou, I'm the UNHCR spokesperson. UNHCR is the UN refugee agency. Our teams are on the ground in Central African Republic and in neighboring countries, welcoming and assisting people forced to flee the tremendous violence that we're seeing that Malcolm's report have highlighted.
Romain, thank you so much for being part of today's show. And David, introduce yourself to our global audience. Nice to have you.
Thank you very much for having me. David Otto, I'm a security specialist focusing a lot on Africa, Central African Republic, the east of Africa and the west of Africa. So it's a great pleasure to be here.
Thanks, David. Malcolm, how long have you been covering the Central African Republic? How would you tell the story of what's happening right now?
The first time I went there was many years ago. I think I went to Obo, which is a remote town in the east. Went there with the Ugandan hunting for the Lord's Resistance Army. But this was my first time in Bongi when I was there last week. Bongi itself was tense, but pretty quiet at the moment. There's a curfew, which is violently enforced. People have been shot at, being caught out and about just a few minutes after 6 p.m. So everyone's kind of scuttling home by 4 or 5 o'clock. The barriers at the edge of the city, you're not allowed to pass because just beyond them were the armed groups who attacked the week before and said that they want to overthrow the government. So it wasn't that's a very conducive opportunity for meeting people but we did get to meet some of the people who've been affected by the conflict in Bangui, and we did, as you mentioned, get across the river. Ubongi, the capital, sits on the river. On the other side is the Democratic Republic of Congo. The river divides the two countries, and that's where tens of thousands of people have fled just in the last few weeks.
I want to bring in a voice of an NGO representative. Romain, have a listen to Haja and then come off the back of Haja, because Haja breaks down what is happening right now for civilians in the Central African Republic. Have a listen, have a look, Romain.
Right now, there are people who have been hiding in the bush because they are scared of future attacks. And that means people living in the most precarious conditions you can think of, not having access to clean water, no food, no health care, and people even washing themselves in muddy water. So with more than half of the country relying on humanitarian assistance, armed actors must guarantee safe access for aid workers to reach people in need, and donors and governments must increase their financial support so aid agencies can respond immediately to humanitarian needs on the ground.
Indeed, I mean, what they have seen and what our teams are telling us from meeting people forced to flee is about the same pictures. People fleeing violence, having hearing shootings, heavy weapons, seeing armed groups evading villages. So they flee. They flee with the very little they can carry. More often than not, they can't carry much. They have the clothes on their back and that's all that they have. And they cross the border to the neighboring countries and in search of safety, in search of security, in search of assistance. In the past weeks, tens of thousands have crossed the borders from Central African Republic to the DRC, Congo. At least 80,000 of them have crossed the border and the river, the Ubangi River. Another 10,000 have crossed to Cameroon and Chad. And the situation is the same. They come with nearly nothing. They need food, they need water. You can see on the pictures that your teams on the ground shot earlier last week. People need mosquito net. They don't have a shelter. They sleep in the open. They arrive in villages that have very seldom to offer, very little water, very little food, and yet they are the first one responding to such an ongoing humanitarian crisis. And what the previous person said is perfectly right. What we need is humanitarian access. Within the Central African Republic, nearly 100,000 people are already displaced and still displaced by the violence, by the latest violence. But what we need to bear in mind is that prior to this violence, nearly 600,000 people were already displaced within the country. We still needed to access them. So security will enable us to go and meet those people to deliver most needed, important humanitarian assistance.
David, in the fighting that's going on in CAR, are the civilians the target or are they being caught in the crossfire?
I think directly and indirectly. As the other two panelists have made it very clear, Central African Republic is in chaos. The rebel groups, that's the Coalition for the Patriotic Central Africans, which is the CPC, has made it very clear in its manifesto that civilians are not the target. That is not true. Indirectly, several civilians have been caught, in the crossfire, either by the forces of FACA or Russian or MINUSCA or, the rebel groups. So whichever way we've looked at it, civilians have become a target of the conflict. I mean, if you talk about humanitarian situations in Central African Republic, you're talking about civilians. Their vulnerability in the crisis is the primary concern for everyone. And no matter how careful MINUSMA has been, no matter how careful the FACA forces or the Russian forces have been, or the Rwandese forces, or even the rebels themselves, civilians are fleeing. They do not trust neither the government to protect them. The role of MINUSMA since 2014 was primarily to protect civilians. But if civilians are fleeing, then it means they cannot be protected, or they cannot be assured that protection.
So the reason, Malcolm,
some of the people we spoke to there actually backed up what you were just saying. One of the things we were hearing Bongi is that the coalition of armed groups who want to be the next government, where we heard, oh, this time they're behaving well, this time they're not hurting civilians, they're not looting, they're not raping. That might be true for those groups or some of those factions. Some of them have a sort of solid command structure and relatively well trained and disciplined troops. But as soon as we got over the river to Congo, we heard completely different stories. Civilians who said, they'd had their huts set on fire, people who'd had relatives killed, raped, all the rest, and it sounded as bad as it did 8 years ago in 2013. So I think it really seemed in their cases that they had very much been targeted by the militia that had come to their villages.
Just want to look at how we got here politically, but not for years and years and years. I'm really just going to look at the last couple of weeks. So the reason Malcolm and Al Jazeera went back to Central African Republic and reported from Central African Republic was because of some contested election results. So let me start here. On January the 13th, and this is when opposition fighters attack Bangui. Bangui is the capital of the Central African Republic. On January the 18th, the court upholds President Touadera's election victory. That was a few days after the CAR's Constitutional Court upheld those election results. So the incumbent President Touadera is now president. And then on January the 21st, he imposed a state of emergency, which is where we are right now. Malcolm, what is it like? What was the atmosphere like when you were there just last week?
Well, in Bangui, it was tense, and people were waiting to see if these armed groups would attack again. And from everything we understand, that those fighters on the armed groups, I think, completely outnumber the fighting forces that are prepared to defend the city. I think in battle, it's the Russian mercenaries and the Rwandan troops that do. I think most of the fighting. The UN peacekeepers are kind of limited by their mandate, and I think the government army soldiers they've had problems often with them running away, not being paid, and so on. So I think there are a few hundred Russians, a few hundred Rwandans. They're the most effective fighters, and then a few thousand groups who are just outside the city, and I think have much heavier weapons, and so people were tense, people were worried, they didn't know what was going to happen, and at the same time there were complaints within the city from since the election or since its results from the political opposition, the civilian political opposition, that there's been somewhat of a crackdown on the part of the government. Like people involved in opposition parties have been threatened, say they've been threatened, so other people have been disappeared, and it seems that the government, according to their reports, was trying to kind of consolidate its fairly fragile grip on power by clamping down on dissident voices within the city as well.
So, gentlemen, I did promise our YouTube audience that they could ask you questions. So let's start here with Jean-Pierre. Jean-Pierre says, CAR is in flames and the whole world is watching. I wonder what is going on in today's world leaders who watch the conflict unfolding right in front of their eyes without any reaction. Romain, I'm sure you think that the whole time. Thoughts? Go ahead.
Oh, indeed. Central African Republic has been for the 5th year in a row among the least covered humanitarian crises in the world. Least covered, that means there was a survey launched at the end of last year that said there were more articles published on PlayStation release than articles on humanitarian crisis combined of those 10 most neglected crises. So it is happening in silence, it has been there for 5 years, and sadly, synonymous to being underreported is there's little funding. Quite often that means we have to ask for more funding. We have to ask for more resources so that we are able to deliver the most needed humanitarian assistance. And here we're talking about water, we're talking about food, we're talking about shelter. Shelter, it's a tent. We're talking about a mosquito net, a mat to sleep on when you're fleeing in a bush and that's all you have with you is the clothes. And if you're lucky, that's the family that managed to follow you. So yes, but the world is watching, and indeed we're having a lot of support from the neighboring countries to start with. DRC, the DR Congo, is welcoming. Go ahead.
Some of your come out on the ground were talking about what they described as donor fatigue with regards to this crisis, especially after what happened 8 years ago, and they thought that's why they weren't getting enough resources now, because they felt that donor governments had, felt like they've put money into this. It hasn't solved it. It's kind of repeating itself, seemingly. And they said that they thought was part of the reason why they were lacking the resources to do what they really needed to do.
Yes, let me go back to YouTube just very briefly. I'm going to ask you for brief responses because you've got a lot of questions here. Thank you for inspiring them. All right, Malcolm, very quickly, what do the rebels want?
Well, they particularly want to take power. We tried to communicate with them a few times. We didn't manage to get through to anybody in a position of authority who could have elaborated or answered questions. They're backed by former President Francois Bozize. There's also a lot of suspicions that they have back around the region, or other people think that or believe that France is backing them, but France has said that its kind of days of military involvement there are kind of pretty much over, and it's not backing this coalition of armed groups. But I guess what's at stake for whoever does control the country or the government or the various parts of the country is mineral resources, significant gold and diamond wealth. There's also uranium. And I think that's one of the things you've got to consider. That's what the essence of this conflict is probably about. It's not, I guess, I think the people that live there are very much sort of victims in in a fight between bigger powers, possibly powers from outside, whether that's Russia and France or Chad or whoever it is that may be involved. But it's a competition for geopolitical control and access to those natural resources. I think that this is what people are caught up in the middle of.
Yeah, I think Malcolm, you're right. But also you've got to look at it from the angle that the rhetoric that the rebels want to take power is, it's one of those things which is being promoted on the social media. They don't really want to take power. If you look at some of the discussions that and the statements that have been put by the KNK, which is the Kwa party of ex-president Francois Bozize, they've made it very clear that because they couldn't run as a presidential candidate for the 2020 elections, they want to make sure that nobody else can rule Central African Republic. They know that it's impossible for the rebels to take power because of the presence of so many MINUSCA forces in Bangui. You've got Russia there. You've also got Rwandese forces. So I think what the rebels want to achieve, is if they cannot, be involved in the politics, then nobody else will be, and that is why you see a continuation of the inability of the government to control any area fully outside Bangui. I mean, MINUSCA came up today and said, they have 40% control of the country. That it is not true that they've lost 3/4 of the country, and that tells you if MINUSCA is struggling to put up this image that they have 40% of the country. So the situation is quite in a way that requires a lot more attention than just funding, to be honest.
So let me just bring in Bruce Bieber into this conversation, because we're talking about politics and relationships between armed groups and the United Nations being there, an international community. What are they doing? And then here's Bruce Bieber and his team trying to just get the wounded into hospital. Have a listen to Bruce Romain. You come off the back of Bruce.
The most urgent need is to evacuate the wounded, to ensure that they reach health structures where they can receive the proper treatment. The ICRC is working to access these places, the places where the fighting has taken place. At the moment, we see some worrying signs in Central African Republic that this right of the wounded to be treated is not being always respected. Now is the time to ensure that the proper measures are taken to ensure protection and proper care for the wounded.
I think, I just wanted to jump in there very quickly before, my colleague comes in. To be honest with you, if you look at what has been happening after the elections, most of the wounded have come from either the government forces or the rebel fighters. We've had very few casualties from the civilian population, and I'm sure that my co-panelists will agree with me. We've seen a lot of people moving and leaving Central African Republic to neighboring DRC and Cameroon. But when it comes to casualties, the civilian population has not suffered as much as it did in 2013, not even close to what happened during the times of the Seleka and anti-balaka crisis. So I think what the focus should be on is for the international community, especially the United Nations, to make good of the role that MINUSCA has to play, but also to seek a dialogue and negotiations route, because the rebels have often shown the willingness to sit down with the government. But the government has made it very clear that they don't want to talk to criminals. And that is impacting on the local population because they were promised before the elections that they will be protected by the state. And at the moment, the state is struggling to secure Bangui, which is just the capital. So we have a problem here.
Malcolm, I want to bring you back into the conversation because you talked to people who had been wounded. I'm actually going to play this little clip from one of your reports, and then you can tell us more about the people that you spoke to and what the civilians were telling you about the conflict in their own country. Let's have a look.
Moise Wabange hoped digging for gold would pay for his education. He worked at a mine in the bush here in the Central African Republic. He'd bought a new motorbike to get there. On his way home, he says militia held him up, stole it, and then told him to lie face down on the ground. He refused.
I told them, if you want to kill me, do it to my face. As we were talking, he shot me in one leg. I started screaming. He saw I could still walk, so he shot the other. Then I couldn't walk anymore.
The bones in Moi's leg are shattered. With it, his plan to study.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Malcolm.
and the story of Moise was tragic, really, and really sad, although he was getting, I think, good medical care there from Doctors Without Borders, and very much hope that he will be able to get back on his feet and find a way to earn the school fees. But yeah, I think his story was typical. He was working in a mine, which was, I think, dangerous but fairly well paid. He was saying he could easily make about $30 in a day, which is a lot more than subsistence farming, for example. And then on a very good day on a new mine, he said, where the people have just started digging, you can even make like as much as $200 in a day. But it's dangerous, of course, because these places people are fighting over these resources, and there's no rule of law there. And indeed, he got caught up, I think, by the sounds of it. He said they took some gold he had in his backpack, and they took that new motorbike that he'd bought. And I guess just having a motorbike that can make you a target, that can make you vulnerable. And he's ended up with these terrible injuries in his legs as a result. And it was very moving indeed, and it was quite a sad story. And I think there were probably a lot more people in similar positions who are able to get to Bangui and aren't able to get to a hospital that has international support like that, as we heard from the lady in New York earlier. People hiding in the bush and so on. I think he was, in that sense, one of the luckier ones to at least be able to get that help and get that treatment.
So right now we have a state of emergency in the Central African Republic. President Touadera, though, says that he's open to negotiations. Let's have a look.
To all those who want to work towards peace and development in the Central African Republic, I am open to discussion and to working towards this. I am not a closed man. You have seen it. We have always had dialogue, but not with those who want to drag the country into violence, blind violence. Justice will deal with those people.
All right, so Guess, I'm just going to ask you, as the journalist, as the analyst, as the humanitarian, although I'm sure some of you are all three of those, what should happen next? David, your sentence.
I think the Central African Republic government of Faustin Touadera should call for a dialogue, irrespective of whether he thinks the rebels are criminals. I think they should call for dialogue and negotiation. That should be what should happen. Yeah.
Romain, what next?
Next is what people want. The people we've met are telling us that they want to return home, and for that to take place, peace must prevail. They need to be able to return home. That means people stop fighting, that they don't risk their lives, that they don't have the fearing of losing their family members, so that they can return to the place they call home. And that's what we should support, and that's what peace will help achieve. What we need as well is also financial support, so that we're able to provide the emergency life-saving assistance that they need most, whether they are displaced in neighboring countries or within the country.
No brilliant journalist like Malcolm Webb would ever tell you what happens next. He will say, watch this space and watch aljazeera.com and watch my next report. Have a look here on my laptop. You can follow all of our guests on Twitter. Malcolm Webb, David Otto, and the UNHCR in West and Central Africa. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.